They ordered retired Master Sergeant Thomas Chen to remove his worn military cap at the security checkpoint, treating him like any other visitor causing trouble. But when General Patricia Hawkins caught sight of the small, almost invisible embroidered insignia hidden beneath the cap's weathered brim, her face went pale. And everything changed in an instant. The autumn morning air carried a crisp bite as Thomas stood in the long line of visitors waiting to enter the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Denver. His weathered hands gripped a manila folder containing documents he'd been trying to get processed for months, the same bureaucratic runaround that had become his weekly ritual. At 62, Thomas moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had endured more than most. Though few would guess the extent of his service just by looking at him, he wore simple civilian clothes, a faded denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt with work boots that had seen better days. The only indication of his military background was the olive green baseball cap perched on his graying head, its fabric soft from years of wear. To the casual observer, he appeared to be just another aging veteran navigating the complex maze of government assistance, one of hundreds who pass through these doors each day seeking help with disabilities, benefits, or medical care. The security line moved slowly, giving Thomas time to observe the bustling activity around him. Young soldiers in dress uniforms hurried past, their crisp movements and polished appearance a stark contrast to his casual attire. He watched them with quiet appreciation, remembering when he too had walked with that same purposeful stride, when every detail of his appearance had been scrutinized and perfected according to military standards. Behind him in line, a middle-aged woman struggled with her purse and a stack of medical papers, clearly overwhelmed by the process. Thomas turned slightly and offered a gentle smile. "First time here?" he asked quietly. She nodded, stress evident in her eyes. "My husband was wounded overseas. I'm trying to figure out his benefits, but the paperwork is so confusing. Everyone keeps sending me to different offices." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with handwritten notes and phone numbers. He tore out a page and handed it to her. "These are the direct numbers for the benefits office. Ask for Sarah Martinez in processing. Tell her Thomas sent you. She'll help you navigate the system." The woman's face brightened with gratitude. "Thank you so much. How did you know?" "I've been coming here for a while," Thomas replied simply, not elaborating on the true extent of his familiarity with the system. He'd spent countless hours helping other veterans navigate the bureaucracy, using connections and knowledge gained through experiences he rarely discussed. As they approached the security checkpoint, Thomas noticed the guard on duty, a young man in his 20s with an attitude that suggested he took his authority very seriously. The guard wore his uniform with obvious pride, his badge polished and his posture rigid as he directed people through the metal detectors and checked identification with methodical precision. "Next," the guard called out, gesturing for Thomas to approach. Thomas handed over his veteran's ID card, the plastic showing signs of wear from frequent use. The guard examined it with unnecessary scrutiny, comparing the photo to Thomas's face multiple times. "Remove the cap, sir," the guard instructed, his tone carrying an edge of impatience. "Hat removal is required for proper identification verification." Thomas hesitated for a moment, his hand moving instinctively to the bill of his cap. "Is that really necessary? The photo shows me without the hat, and my face is clearly visible." The guard's expression hardened. "Sir, I need you to remove the cap. It's policy, no exceptions." Several people in line behind Thomas began to shift impatiently, and he could feel their eyes on him. The guard seemed to interpret his hesitation as defiance, stepping closer with increased authority. "Sir, if you can't follow simple security procedures, I'll have to ask you to step aside and speak with my supervisor. Remove the cap now, or you'll need to leave the facility." Thomas felt the familiar weight of judgment, the assumption that he was just another difficult veteran causing problems. He'd encountered this attitude countless times over the years, the way people looked at older veterans as burdens on the system, rather than individuals who had served their country with distinction. The guard saw only an aging man in civilian clothes, someone to be processed efficiently and moved along. "Look, I understand you have procedures," Thomas said calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "I'm here for a routine appointment, same as every week. My identification is valid, and I'm not trying to cause any trouble." But the guard was already reaching for his radio, clearly preparing to call for backup. The situation was escalating unnecessarily, drawing attention from other staff members and visitors. Thomas could see that continuing to resist would only make things worse, potentially causing him to miss his appointment entirely. Just as he was about to comply with the guard's demand, the sound of approaching footsteps caused both men to turn. General Patricia Hawkins was walking toward the security checkpoint, her 4-star insignia clearly visible on her dress uniform. She moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere. In the area, the guard snapped to attention, his earlier aggression replaced by nervous respect. "General, we have a small situation here. This visitor is refusing to comply with security protocols." General Hawkins looked from the guard to Thomas, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading people and situations. Her gaze lingered on Thomas's face, something in his bearing catching her attention, even before she noticed the significance of what would soon be revealed. General Hawkins stepped closer to the security checkpoint, her polished dress shoes clicking against the polished floor with military precision. The bustling activity of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center seemed to quiet slightly in her presence, as staff members and visitors alike recognized the authority she carried. Her eyes moved methodically between Thomas and the security guard, assessing the situation with the analytical mind that had served her well throughout her distinguished career. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts before they escalated. The guard straightened even further, if such a thing were possible, clearly nervous about explaining the situation to such a high-ranking officer. "Ma'am, this gentleman is refusing to remove his cap for proper identification verification. I've explained our security protocols multiple times, but he continues to resist compliance," the guard reported, his voice taking on a more formal tone in the general's presence. Thomas remained calm, understanding that this moment could determine whether his day proceeded smoothly or devolved into a bureaucratic nightmare. He'd learned long ago that confrontation rarely led to positive outcomes in these situations. Instead, he maintained his respectful posture while preparing to explain his position. "General, I apologize for any disruption," Thomas began, his voice steady and respectful. "I've been coming to this facility regularly for medical appointments and have never had an issue with identification verification while wearing my cap. I'm not trying to circumvent security procedures, but removing the cap seems unnecessary given that my face is clearly visible and matches my identification." The general studied Thomas more carefully, noting details that the younger guard had missed. She observed his posture, the way he held himself with quiet dignity despite the uncomfortable situation. There was something in his bearing that spoke of military training, though she couldn't immediately place what branch or era of service he might represent. "May I see your identification?" she requested, extending her hand. Thomas handed over his veteran's ID card without hesitation, watching as she examined it with the thoroughness of someone familiar with military documentation. Her eyebrows raised slightly as she noted certain details on the card that indicated his service had been more extensive than his current appearance might suggest. The guard shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether he should continue pressing his original demand or defer to the general's handling of the situation. Other visitors in line waited patiently, some checking their phones while others watched the interaction with curiosity. The woman Thomas had helped earlier looked on with concern, hoping the kind stranger who had assisted her wouldn't get into trouble. "Mr. Chen," the general said, reading from his identification. "Thomas Chen, your card indicates service in multiple theaters. Iraq, Afghanistan." She paused, studying the dates and service codes printed on the military identification. "Quite extensive deployment history." Thomas nodded simply. "Yes, ma'am. I served where I was needed." The general's experience told her there was more to this man's story than appeared on the surface. His calm demeanor under pressure, the respectful way he addressed her, and the details on his identification suggested someone with significant military experience. However, she also understood the guard's position regarding security protocols. "The security procedures are in place for good reason," she acknowledged, addressing both Thomas and the guard. "However, I think we can resolve this situation professionally." She turned to the guard. "Specialist Rodriguez, I'll take responsibility for verifying this gentleman's identification. You can continue processing the other visitors." The guard looked relieved to have the situation taken off his hands, though he remained nearby in case the general needed assistance. Thomas appreciated her diplomatic approach, recognizing the skill with which she had diffused the tension while maintaining respect for everyone involved. "Mr. Chen, I understand your position, and I respect your service record," the general continued. "However, our security team has protocols they must follow consistently. Would you be willing to briefly remove your cap so we can complete the verification process and get you to your appointment on time?" Thomas hesitated, his hand moving again toward the bill of his cap. There was something about this particular piece of headwear that clearly held significance for him, though the reason wasn't immediately apparent to observers. The cap itself appeared unremarkable, a standard olive green baseball cap that thousands of veterans wore as a subtle indication of their military service. "General, I appreciate your intervention," Thomas replied carefully. "The cap, it has sentimental value. My preference would be to keep it on if possible, but I understand you have procedures to follow." The general noticed his reluctance and began to wonder what could make a simple baseball cap so important to a veteran. In her experience, certain items of military gear or clothing carried deep emotional significance for those who had served, often representing memories of fallen comrades, significant operations, or personal achievements that weren't immediately visible to others. "I tell you what," she said, demonstrating the problem-solving approach that had earned her respect throughout her career. "Why don't we step over to the private security office where you can remove the cap briefly for verification in a more discreet setting? That way we maintain security protocols while respecting your privacy." The suggestion seemed reasonable to everyone involved. Thomas nodded his agreement, grateful for the general's understanding and creative solution. The guard looked satisfied that protocols would be followed, even if not in the exact manner he had originally intended. As they began walking toward the security office, the general found herself increasingly curious about Thomas Chen's background. His veteran's identification indicated extensive service, but there were codes and designations that suggested his military experience might have been more specialized than typical infantry or support roles. The respect he showed for military hierarchy, combined with his obvious discomfort at removing his cap, suggested there might be more to his story than met the eye. The private security office was a small, windowless room adjacent to the main checkpoint, furnished with a basic desk, 2 chairs, and monitoring equipment that hummed quietly in the background. General Hawkins gestured for Thomas to take a seat while she closed the door behind them, creating the privacy she had promised. The fluorescent lighting cast a stark glow over the cramped space, but it served its purpose of providing a discreet environment for resolving the identification issue. Thomas settled into one of the plastic chairs, his manila folder resting on his lap as he waited for the general to complete her review. She took the seat across from him, placing his veteran's identification card on the desk between them while maintaining the professional demeanor that had characterized their interaction thus far. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that I appreciate your patience with this process," she began, her tone more conversational now that they were away from the public area. "Security protocols can sometimes seem excessive, but given the current climate and the sensitivity of our facilities, we have to be thorough." Thomas nodded understandingly. "I've worked in secure environments before, General. I know the importance of following procedures, even when they seem inconvenient. I just prefer to avoid unnecessary attention when possible." The General studied his face more carefully in the better lighting of the office. She could see lines around his eyes, but also the kind of weathered features that spoke of time spent in harsh environments under difficult conditions. There was a quiet strength in his expression, the look of someone who had faced challenges and emerged with his dignity intact. "Your service record indicates multiple deployments over a significant period," she observed, referring to the codes on his identification. 15 years of active duty, with postings in some rather challenging locations. That's quite a commitment to service." "It was an honor to serve," Thomas replied simply, his words carrying the weight of genuine conviction rather than empty platitudes. "I was fortunate to work with exceptional people and contribute to missions that mattered." As they spoke, the General found herself impressed by Thomas's demeanor. Despite the awkward circumstances that had brought them to this private meeting, he maintained a respectful bearing without seeming subservient. There was a confidence in his manner that suggested someone accustomed to responsibility and decision-making. Though he wore his experience lightly, "I notice you mention coming here regularly for appointments," she continued, attempting to understand more about his current situation. "Are you receiving treatment for service-connected issues?" Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, a brief shadow passing across his features. "Some ongoing medical matters related to my deployments, yes. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of wear and tear that accumulates over time in certain types of assignments. The staff here has been very helpful in managing my care." The General recognized the understated way many veterans describe their service-related health issues, often minimizing problems that significantly impacted their daily lives. She had encountered countless former service members who downplayed their struggles, viewing any acknowledgement of difficulty as a sign of weakness rather than a natural consequence of their sacrifices. "The VA system can be complex to navigate," she acknowledged. "Even for those of us still in uniform, the bureaucracy can be challenging. I imagine it's even more difficult for veterans transitioning to civilian life." "I've been fortunate," Thomas said. "I've learned the system over time, and I try to help other veterans when I can. There are a lot of people who need assistance figuring out how to access the services they've earned." This comment caught the General's attention. The idea that Thomas regularly helped other veterans suggested a level of engagement with the VA system that went beyond his own personal needs. It painted a picture of someone who remained committed to service even after leaving active duty, continuing to look out for fellow veterans in whatever way he could. "That's commendable," she said genuinely. "The transition from military to civilian life can be one of the most challenging aspects of service. Having experienced veterans who can guide newcomers through the process is invaluable." Thomas glanced at his watch, a simple military-style timepiece that had clearly seen years of use. "General, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you have important responsibilities, and I have an appointment I need to make." The General appreciated his consideration, but she found herself reluctant to rush through this interaction. There was something about Thomas Chen that intrigued her, a sense that his story contained depth she hadn't yet discovered. His calm handling of the security situation, his evident knowledge of military protocol, and his understated way of describing his service all suggested someone with significant experience. "Of course," she agreed. Let's complete the identification verification so you can get to your appointment." She paused, looking at him with curious eyes. "If you don't mind me asking, what was your military occupational specialty?" "Your service record indicates extensive deployment time, but the codes are somewhat general." Thomas considered his response carefully, as though weighing how much detail to provide. "I worked in various capacities depending on mission requirements. Intelligence gathering, liaison work, special operations support. The specific details often remain classified, but I can say it involved working closely with local populations and coalition forces." This description confirmed the general's growing suspicion that Thomas's military experience had been more specialized than typical infantry service. The mention of intelligence work and special operations support suggested someone who had operated in sensitive environments requiring both technical skills and cultural awareness. "That type of work requires specialized training and clearances," she observed. "Not everyone is suited for those kinds of assignments." "I was fortunate to work with some of the best people in the military," Thomas replied, deflecting attention from his own role while acknowledging the quality of his former colleagues. "Success in those environments depends on teamwork and trust, more than individual capabilities." The general recognized the humility common among elite military personnel, who often emphasized collective achievement over personal recognition. This characteristic, combined with everything else she had observed about Thomas, was building a picture of someone whose service had been far more significant than his current appearance might suggest. The general leaned back in her chair, recognizing that they had reached the point where the identification verification needed to be completed. The conversation had revealed intriguing details about Thomas's background, but protocol required visual confirmation to match his appearance with his official documentation. She maintained her professional demeanor while acknowledging the sensitivity he had shown regarding his cap. "Mr. Chen, I understand your reluctance about removing your cap, and I want to assure you that this verification will be brief and confidential," she said, her voice carrying both authority and respect. "Once we confirm your identification, you'll be free to proceed to your appointment without any further delays." Thomas looked down at his hands for a moment, his fingers drumming silently against the manila folder in his lap. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the small office as he weighed his options. The general waited patiently, recognizing that whatever significance the cap held for him, the decision to remove it was not one he took lightly. "General, before I comply with your request, I want you to understand that this cap represents more than just military service to me," Thomas said quietly. "It carries memories of people I served with, missions we completed together, and sacrifices that were made. When I put it on each morning, I'm honoring commitments that extend beyond my active duty service." The sincerity in his voice resonated with the general, who had her own collection of military memorabilia that held deep personal significance. She understood how certain items could serve as tangible connections to experiences that had shaped one's entire life. Every veteran she knew had objects that carried emotional weight far beyond their material value. "I respect that, Mr. Chen," she replied with genuine understanding. Military service creates bonds and memories that civilian life often fails to fully comprehend. If this cap holds that kind of meaning for you, I want to handle this verification with appropriate sensitivity." Thomas nodded appreciatively, then slowly reached up and grasped the bill of his cap. As he prepared to remove it, he spoke again, his voice carrying the mixture of resignation and resolve. "General, I've spent years trying to blend in, to avoid drawing attention to myself or my past service. Sometimes the hardest part of coming home is learning how to be a regular citizen again." The general watched as Thomas carefully lifted the cap from his head, revealing graying hair that was still cut in a precise military style, despite his years of civilian life. His movements were deliberate and respectful, treating the cap as Though it were a piece of sacred ceremonial equipment rather than simple HEODWEAR. As the cap came away from his head, the general's trained eye immediately focused on verifying that his appearance matched his identification photograph. The basic features aligned correctly, the same angular face, similar eye shape, matching ear configuration. But as she completed this routine verification, something else caught her attention that made her pause and look more carefully. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the security office, she could see subtle details that hadn't been visible when Thomas wore the cap. There were faint scars along his hairline, the kind that suggested someone who had been in situations where protective gear had been essential. More significantly, she noticed how he held himself even when seated, a posture that spoke of years of disciplined military bearing that couldn't be completely suppressed even in civilian clothes. "Your identification checks out perfectly," she confirmed, completing the official verification process. "The photograph matches your current appearance, and all the documentation appears to be in order." But even as she spoke these routine words, the general found herself studying Thomas with renewed interest. Sensing that there were layers to his story that hadn't yet been revealed, Thomas began to replace the cap on his head, but the general held up a gentle hand. "Mr. Chen, if you don't mind, could you hold off on putting the cap back on for just a moment? I'd like to take another look at your service documentation while I can see your full appearance clearly." Something in her tone suggested this wasn't merely a continuation of the security verification process. Thomas remained still, the cap held loosely in his hands as the general picked up his identification card and studied it more intently than she had before. She was looking at the codes and designations with the experienced eye of someone who understood military documentation at a deeper level. "These deployment codes," she said, pointing to a series of numbers and letters on the identification. "Some of these locations and time periods correspond to operations that were highly classified at the time." She looked up at Thomas with increased curiosity. "The combination of these assignments suggests you were involved in some very specialized missions." Thomas remained silent, understanding that certain details of his service were not appropriate for discussion even years after his retirement. The general recognized his discretion and appreciated it, but her growing awareness of the significance of his background was evident in her increasingly focused attention. "I'm beginning to understand why you prefer to maintain a low profile," she continued thoughtfully. "The kind of work indicated by these codes often requires people to become comfortable with anonymity, even after their service ends." The silence in the small office stretched between them as the general processed what she was discovering about Thomas's background. Her years of experience with classified operations and special assignments were allowing her to read between the lines of his official documentation in ways that most people couldn't. "Mr. Chen, I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for people who have served in the capacities that your record suggests," she said carefully, maintaining the discretion that such conversations required. "The sacrifices made by individuals in those roles often go unrecognized by the general public, but they are not forgotten by those of us who understand their importance." Thomas met her gaze directly, acknowledging her understanding without compromising operational security or revealing classified information. In that moment, a mutual recognition passed between them, the kind of professional respect that exists between people who have both served at the highest levels of military responsibility. The general set Thomas's identification card down on the desk and leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting from routine professional interest to something approaching genuine concern. The codes and designations she had been studying were beginning to form a pattern that suggested Thomas's military service had been far more significant than his humble demeanor indicated. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer will remain completely confidential," she said, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation couldn't be overheard even in the private office. Some of these assignment codes indicate involvement with Joint Task Force operations that were extremely sensitive. The timeline suggests you may have been working in environments where traditional military structure was not flexible. Thomas remained motionless, his cap still held in his hands as he considered how to respond. The general's growing awareness of his background was creating a situation he had hoped to avoid, but her discretion and obvious understanding of operational security protocols suggested she could be trusted with certain information. "General, I appreciate your discretion in handling this matter," he replied carefully. "You're correct that some of my assignments required working outside conventional military frameworks. The specific details remain classified, but I can confirm that I served in roles that demanded both operational flexibility and absolute confidentiality." The general nodded, recognizing the careful way Thomas was acknowledging her observations without revealing protected information. Her experience with special operations personnel had taught her to read the subtle indicators that distinguish truly elite operators from conventional military personnel. And everything about Thomas was confirming her growing suspicions about his background. "The reason I'm pressing this point," she continued, "is that I'm beginning to suspect you're not here at the VA simply as a regular veteran seeking routine medical care. The combination of your assignment history, your obvious knowledge of military protocol, and your reluctance to draw attention to yourself suggests someone who may still be involved in sensitive work." Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, a barely perceptible movement that nonetheless conveyed his discomfort with the direction of the conversation. The general's analytical skills were proving more penetrating than he had anticipated, and he found himself in the awkward position of needing to maintain operational security while respecting her legitimate authority and genuine concern. "General, I can assure you that my visits to this facility are purely for medical purposes related to my documented service-connected issues," he said, choosing his words with precise care. "I'm not involved in any current operations or activities that would compromise facility security or require special protocols." But even as he provided this reassurance, Thomas realized that his careful phrasing was probably revealing as much as it concealed to someone with the general's experience. She was clearly skilled at reading between the lines of conversations that touched on sensitive subjects, and his reluctance to provide more detailed answers was itself becoming a form of communication. The general studied his face intently, noting the controlled way he was managing the conversation and the professional distance he was maintaining despite her increasingly direct questions. These were not the responses of a typical retired veteran, but rather the careful communications of someone trained in information security and operational discretion. "Mr. Chen, I want you to understand that I'm not trying to compromise any ongoing activities or violate operational security," she said, demonstrating her own understanding of how such matters needed to be handled. "My concern is ensuring that someone with your apparent background receives appropriate recognition and support within our system." This statement seemed to catch Thomas off guard, as though he hadn't expected the conversation to move toward acknowledgement rather than interrogation. For years, he had grown accustomed to downplaying his military experience and avoiding situations that might draw attention to his background. The idea that someone in authority might want to ensure he received proper recognition was almost foreign to his recent experience. "General, I appreciate your concern, but I've never sought special treatment or recognition," he replied honestly. "My preference has always been to handle my affairs quietly and avoid drawing attention to past assignments that may still have security implications." The general recognized the humility that was characteristic of truly elite military personnel, who often deflected recognition and preferred to maintain anonymity even years after their service. But she also understood that this preference for invisibility sometimes prevented deserving veterans from receiving the support and acknowledgement they had earned through their sacrifices. "I understand that inclination," she said, "but sometimes the people who are most reluctant to seek recognition are exactly the ones who deserve it most. She paused, considering her next words carefully. Would you be willing to show me the interior of your cap? Sometimes personal military items contain details that provide additional context about someone's service. Thomas hesitated, his hands tightening slightly on the cap he still held. The general's request was reasonable given their conversation, but it would potentially reveal information he had kept private for years. The interior of his cap contained elements that would immediately clarify his background to anyone knowledgeable about special operations insignia and recognition symbols. General, what you're asking could reveal details that I've kept confidential for operational security reasons, he said slowly. Not because they're currently classified, but because the recognition they represent could draw attention I've preferred to avoid. The general sensed they were approaching the heart of whatever Thomas had been concealing. Her years of experience with special operations personnel had taught her that truly elite operators often carried recognition of their achievements in subtle, personal ways that remained invisible to casual observers, but were meaningful to those who understood their significance. Mr. Chen, I give you my word that whatever I see will be treated with appropriate discretion, she assured him. If you have concerns about operational security, we can discuss how to handle any sensitive information properly. But I suspect that what you're carrying may represent achievements that deserve recognition rather than concealment. Thomas looked down at the cap in his hands, weighing the risks and benefits of revealing what he had kept hidden for so long. The general's obvious knowledge of military operations and her demonstrated discretion suggested she could be trusted. But years of maintaining operational security had made revealing such information feel almost unnatural. Thomas took a deep breath, his decision crystallizing as he weighed the general's genuine concern against his years of practiced secrecy. The fluorescent lights hummed above them as he slowly turned the cap over in his hands, revealing the interior that he had kept hidden from public view for so long. His movements were deliberate and careful, as though he were handling something sacred rather than a simple piece of headwear. General, what you're about to see represents operations and people that most of the world will never know existed, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of memories that stretched back across multiple decades and continents. I've kept this private not out of shame, but out of respect for the classified nature of the work and the teammates who didn't make it home. As he held the cap open for her inspection, the general leaned forward to examine the interior. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. Carefully embroidered into the inner lining, almost invisible unless specifically looked for, was a series of small insignia and symbols that told a story of extraordinary service and sacrifice. The most prominent feature was a subdued version of the Special Operations Command patch, but surrounding it were smaller elements that indicated specific missions and achievements. There were tiny representations of theater ribbons from operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and other locations that weren't commonly discussed in public military discourse. Each symbol was meticulously crafted, clearly the work of someone who understood the significance of what they were creating. But what truly made the general's eyes widen was a small, almost microscopic embroidered representation of the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to members of the United States Army. Beneath it, in thread so fine it was barely visible, were the words Operation Desert Falcon -2003 and coordinates that she recognized as referring to a location in Iraq where a particularly dangerous rescue mission had taken place. Mr. Chen, she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and respect. This represents extraordinary service. The Distinguished Service Cross is not awarded lightly, and the operations indicated by these other symbols suggest a level of contribution that goes far beyond typical military service. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes distant as memories flooded back. The Distinguished Service Cross was for leading a rescue operation when our intelligence team was pinned down behind enemy lines. We had been gathering information on a high-value target when our position was compromised. Conventional extraction wasn't possible due to the terrain and enemy presence. The general listened intently as Thomas continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone recounting events that had been seared into his memory. I volunteered to go in alone, using knowledge of the local area and contacts I had developed during previous operations. The mission required moving through heavily patrolled territory and coordinating with resistance fighters who had their own reasons for wanting to help. As he spoke, the general could see other details in the cap's interior that supported his account. There were small symbols representing various foreign military decorations, suggesting that his service had been recognized not only by the United States, but by allied nations whose forces he had supported during joint operations. The rescue itself took 48 hours, Thomas continued, his eyes focused on a point beyond the walls of the small office. 6 team members were trapped in a compound that was being systematically searched by enemy forces. Traditional military response would have taken too long and likely resulted in casualties. The operation required moving through the city at night, avoiding checkpoints, and coordinating the extraction that looked like a local insurgent action rather than an American military operation. The general found herself completely absorbed in Thomas's account, recognizing the kind of mission that represented the absolute pinnacle of special operations work. The combination of tactical skill, cultural knowledge, and sheer courage required for such an operation was possessed by very few individuals, even within elite military units. "How did you manage the extraction?" she asked, her professional curiosity overcoming the formal distance she had been maintaining. Thomas managed a slight smile, the first time his expression had lightened since their conversation began. Key was making it look like something it wasn't. We staged the rescue to appear like a local criminal operation, complete with stolen vehicles and confusion that drew security forces away from our actual extraction route. By the time anyone realized what had actually happened, we were already at the extraction point with all 6 team members safely recovered. The general shook her head in amazement, understanding the level of planning, coordination, and execution such an operation would have required. "And the other symbols in your cap, they represent additional operations?" "Different missions, different theaters, different challenges," Thomas confirmed. "Some were intelligence gathering, others were direct action, and a few were training operations with allied forces. The common thread was that they all required working outside conventional military structure and often in coordination with local assets who were risking their lives to support American interests." Looking more closely at the interior of the cap, the general could see that each symbol had been placed with careful consideration for its relationship to the others. This wasn't simply a random collection of military memorabilia, but rather a carefully curated record of a career spent in the most challenging and dangerous aspects of military service. "Mr. Chen, this level of service and the recognition it are EPR-ECNTS. This should be acknowledged, not hidden," she said with conviction. "The Distinguished Service Cross alone represents heroism that deserves recognition, but the scope of operations indicated by these other symbols suggests a career of exceptional contribution to national security." Thomas carefully closed the cap, returning it to its normal appearance where the extraordinary achievements it contained were once again invisible to casual observation. "General, I've never sought recognition for this work. The operations were successful, my teammates came home safely, and the missions accomplished their objectives. That was always enough for me." The general sat back in her chair, processing everything she had learned about the unassuming man sitting across from her. His humble demeanor and preference for anonymity suddenly made perfect sense, as did his apparent knowledge of VA procedures and his willingness to help other veterans navigate the system. The silence in the small office stretched between them as General Hawkins processed the full magnitude of what she had discovered. Thomas sat quietly, having replaced his cap on his head, once again appearing to be nothing more than an ordinary veteran seeking routine medical care. But the General's perception of him had been fundamentally altered by what she had seen embroidered within that weathered fabric. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something directly," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of urgency. "Are you receiving the level of care and support that someone with your service record should be receiving? Because based on what I've just learned, I suspect the answer is no." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly reluctant to discuss his personal circumstances in detail. "General, I receive adequate medical care for my service-connected issues. The staff here is professional and competent. I don't require any special treatment or accommodations." But the General had spent enough time navigating military bureaucracy to recognize when someone was understating their situation. "Mr. Chen, someone with a distinguished service cross and the level of specialized service you've described should have access to priority care scheduling, specialized treatment programs, and comprehensive support services. Are you telling me you're being processed through the standard veteran care system like everyone else?" The question hung in the air as Thomas considered how to respond. The truth was that he had never mentioned his decorations or specialized service record to the VA staff, preferring to handle his affairs as just another veteran rather than seeking any special consideration. His appointments were scheduled weeks in advance. He waited in the same lines as everyone else, and his medical care, while adequate, was certainly not expedited or enhanced in any way. "I've never felt it was appropriate to request special treatment based on past service," he replied carefully. "The VA system serves many veterans with significant needs, and I didn't want to take resources or attention away from others who might need them more urgently." General Hawkins felt a mixture of admiration and frustration at Thomas's response. His selflessness was admirable, but potentially harmful to his own well-being. "Mr. Chen, the enhanced services available to recipients of high military decorations exist because Congress and military leadership recognize that certain levels of service and sacrifice deserve priority recognition. You're not taking resources away from other veterans. You're accessing services that you specifically earned through your extraordinary contributions." Thomas looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Years of maintaining a low profile had made accepting recognition feel almost foreign to him. "General, I appreciate your concern, but I've managed just fine with the standard level of care. My medical issues are being addressed, and I have no complaints about the treatment I've received." The General leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "Mr. Chen, this isn't just about medical care. Someone with your background and demonstrated capabilities should be involved in training programs, mentorship roles, or consulting positions where your experience could benefit current service members. The military is constantly seeking people with real-world experience in special operations to help prepare the next generation of operators." This suggestion seemed to catch Thomas's attention in a way that discussions of his own benefits hadn't. The idea of contributing to current military training and preparation was clearly something that appealed to his sense of continued service. "What kind of programs are you referring to, General?" "There are several initiatives where your expertise would be invaluable," she explained, her enthusiasm growing as she saw his interest. "Advanced tactical training programs, leadership development courses for special operations personnel, and consulting roles in mission planning and cultural awareness training. Your combination of operational experience and cultural knowledge would be extremely valuable." Thomas considered this possibility, clearly intrigued by the idea of returning to meaningful service in some capacity. "I hadn't considered that there might be opportunities to contribute in that way. I assumed that my active service days were behind me permanently." The general smiled, recognizing that she had found the right approach to engage Thomas's interest. Mr. Chen, people with your level of experience and proven capability don't simply retire and disappear. The knowledge and skills you've developed over your career represent a national asset that should be utilized, not wasted. As she spoke, the general was already formulating plans for how to properly integrate someone of Thomas's caliber into current military development programs. His experience with cross-cultural operations, unconventional warfare, and high-stakes rescue missions represented exactly the kind of real-world knowledge that classroom instruction couldn't provide. "There's something else I want to discuss with you," she continued, pulling out her phone to check her calendar. "Next week, we're hosting a conference on special operations training methodologies at the Pentagon. The attendees include training commanders, tactical development specialists, and senior officers responsible for preparing special operations personnel for deployment. Your perspective on these issues would be incredibly valuable." Thomas raised his eyebrows, surprised by the specific nature of the opportunity being presented. "General, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to address senior military leadership on current training methodologies. My experience is from specific operations under particular circumstances." "That's exactly what makes your perspective valuable," the general insisted. "Academic approaches to training can only go so far. The officers attending this conference need to hear from someone who has actually executed the kinds of missions they're trying to prepare people for. Your experience with cultural integration, unconventional tactics, and high-pressure decision-making represents knowledge that can't be learned from textbooks." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Specialist Rodriguez, the security guard from the checkpoint, appeared with an apologetic expression. "General, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation at the main entrance that requires your attention." General Hawkins looked at Thomas, clearly reluctant to end their conversation at such a crucial point. "Mr. Chen, I don't want to keep you from your appointment any longer, but I hope you'll seriously consider what we've discussed. Someone with your background has continued opportunities to serve and contribute, and frankly, the military needs people like you." Thomas stood up, gathering his manila folder and adjusting his cap. "General, I appreciate everything you've shared with me today. You've given me a lot to think about regarding ways I might continue to contribute. I'll definitely consider the opportunities you've mentioned." As they prepared to leave the office, the general handed Thomas her business card. "Mr. Chen, I want you to call me directly when you're ready to discuss these possibilities further. And I meant what I said about ensuring you receive appropriate recognition and support for your service record." As Thomas and General Hawkins emerged from the private security office, the bustling atmosphere of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center seemed to take on a different quality. Thomas walked with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the morning, but the general found herself seeing him through completely new eyes. What had begun as a routine security verification had transformed into a profound recognition of extraordinary service that had been hidden in plain sight. "Specialist." Rodriguez stood waiting near the main checkpoint, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious nervousness at having interrupted the general's private meeting. "Ma'am, we have a situation with a veteran at the main entrance who's become agitated about wait times and is demanding to speak with someone in authority. The situation is escalating and other visitors are becoming concerned." General Hawkins nodded professionally, understanding that such incidents were unfortunately common at VA facilities where frustrated veterans sometimes reached their breaking point while navigating complex bureaucratic systems. "I'll handle it, Specialist. Thank you for informing me promptly." As they walked toward the main entrance, Thomas could hear raised voices echoing through the lobby area. A middle-aged man in a wheelchair was gesturing emphatically at the reception desk staff, his voice carrying the strain of someone who had reached the limits of his patience. Other veterans in the waiting area watched the scene with expressions ranging from sympathy to concern, understanding the frustration that had led to the outburst. This is exactly the kind of situation where someone with your experience could make a difference, General Hawkins said quietly to Thomas as they approached. You mentioned helping other veterans navigate the system. Have you encountered situations like this before? Thomas observed the scene carefully, noting details that his years of working with stressed individuals had taught him to recognize. The veteran's body language suggested frustration rather than genuine aggression, and his complaints seemed to focus on systemic issues rather than personal grievances against the staff members who were trying to help him. The gentleman appears to be dealing with appointment scheduling problems and medication prescription delays, Thomas replied, having quickly assessed the situation. Based on what I can hear, he's been trying to resolve these issues for several weeks without success. His anger is directed at the system rather than the individuals, which suggests he can probably be de-escalated with the right approach. The general was impressed by Thomas's rapid analysis of the complex interpersonal dynamics at play. His ability to quickly understand both the surface conflict and the underlying issues demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that had obviously served him well during his military career. Would you be willing to assist? She asked, recognizing an opportunity to see Thomas's leadership skills in action. As a fellow veteran, you might be able to connect with him in ways that staff members or military personnel in uniform cannot. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his natural inclination toward maintaining a low profile conflicting with his desire to help a fellow veteran in distress. General, I'm not officially authorized to intervene in facility operations, and I don't want to overstep any boundaries or create additional complications. Consider it an informal consultation, the general replied, her tone making it clear that she was authorizing his involvement. Sometimes peer support from fellow veterans is more effective than official intervention. Thomas nodded and approached the situation with the calm confidence that had characterized his military service. As he drew closer, he could hear the specific nature of the veteran's complaints more clearly. The man was describing a series of bureaucratic failures that had resulted in missed appointments, delayed prescription refills, and conflicting information from different departments within the VA system. Excuse me, Thomas said quietly, positioning himself where the agitated veteran could see him without feeling cornered or threatened. I couldn't help but overhear some of your concerns. I'm Thomas Chen, and I've been working with the VA system for several years. Would you mind if I tried to help you sort through some of these issues? The veteran in the wheelchair looked up at Thomas, his anger momentarily replaced by curiosity. Are you staff here? Because I've been talking to staff for weeks, and nobody seems to be able to give me straight answers about anything. No, I'm not staff, Thomas replied honestly. I'm a veteran like you, and I've learned how to navigate this system through trial and error over the years. Sometimes it helps to have someone who's been through the same frustrations explain how things actually work here. This approach seemed to resonate with the frustrated veteran, whose defensive posture began to relax slightly. I'm Robert Martinez, Army Infantry, 3 tours in Iraq. I've been trying to get my disability rating adjusted and my pain medication prescription renewed, but every department keeps sending me to a different department. Thomas nodded understandingly, recognizing the circular referral pattern that often trapped veterans in bureaucratic loops. Robert, I've been through similar situations myself. The key is understanding which offices actually have the authority to resolve specific issues and which ones are just processing centers that shuffle paperwork around. General Hawkins watched from a discreet distance as Thomas began explaining the VA system structure to Robert Martinez, noting how his calm demeanor and obvious knowledge were immediately establishing credibility and trust. The other veterans in the waiting area had stopped their own conversations to listen, clearly interested in information that might help them navigate their own challenges. The disability rating adjustment has to be initiated through the Regional Benefits Office, But the medical documentation needs to come from your primary care physician here at the medical center," Thomas explained, pulling out his small notebook and writing down specific office numbers and contact names. "The prescription renewal is completely separate and should be handled through the Pharmacy Services Department, but they need current medical evaluations to process controlled substance prescriptions." Robert Martinez looked at the information Thomas was providing, his frustration beginning to transform into hope as he realized he was finally receiving actionable guidance. "So I need to coordinate between 3 different offices to get these 2 issues resolved?" "Exactly," Thomas confirmed. "And the timing matters because each office has different processing schedules. If you submit the medical evaluation request, first, it will be ready when the benefits office needs it for your rating review." As Thomas continued providing detailed guidance, General Hawkins realized she was witnessing something remarkable. This unassuming veteran, who had been sitting quietly in security lines and downplaying his own needs, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of VA procedures and a natural ability to explain complex, bureaucratic processes in terms that frustrated veterans could understand and act upon. "Mr. Chen," she said, approaching the group that had formed around Thomas as he helped Robert Martinez and answered questions from other veterans who had gathered to listen. "I think we need to talk about that consulting opportunity I mentioned earlier. What I'm seeing here suggests your skills could benefit thousands of veterans rather than just the individuals you encounter during your personal visits." Thomas looked up from his conversation with Robert Martinez, momentarily surprised by the general's observation. The small crowd of veterans that had gathered around them was listening intently as he continued to provide practical guidance on navigating the VA system. What had started as assistance to one frustrated individual had organically evolved into an impromptu, educational session that was clearly benefiting multiple people. "Mr. Chen here just saved me weeks of running around in circles," Robert Martinez announced to the group, his earlier anger completely replaced by genuine gratitude. "He knows exactly which offices handle what and how to get things done efficiently. I've been dealing with this bureaucracy for months, and nobody else has been able to explain it this clearly." An elderly veteran wearing a Vietnam-era service cap nodded in agreement. "I've been trying to get my Agent Orange claim processed for 2 years. The information you just shared about medical documentation requirements explains why my application keeps getting delayed." General Hawkins observed the dynamic that was developing around Thomas with growing amazement. His ability to synthesize complex bureaucratic procedures into actionable guidance was clearly a skill that extended far beyond typical veteran peer support. The depth of his knowledge and his natural teaching ability suggested someone who could make a significant impact on veteran services at a much larger scale. "Thomas, if I may call you that," the general said, stepping closer to the group, "what you're demonstrating here is exactly the kind of practical knowledge that our veteran services training programs desperately need. You're not just helping individuals solve their immediate problems, you're teaching them how to understand and navigate the system independently." Thomas finished writing down contact information for the elderly veteran before responding to the general's comment. "It's really just a matter of understanding how government bureaucracy works and being willing to spend time learning the specific procedures. Once you know which offices have actual authority versus which ones just process paperwork, most problems become much easier to solve." "But that knowledge takes years to acquire," interjected a younger veteran who had been listening to the conversation. "I've been out of the service for 6 months, and I had no idea any of this information existed. The orientation they give you when you first register doesn't cover any of these details." This comment seemed to resonate with several other veterans in the group, who began sharing their own experiences with inadequate information and confusing initial guidance. General Hawkins listened carefully to these testimonials, recognizing a systemic problem that someone with Thomas's expertise could potentially address. Thomas, what these veterans are describing represents a significant gap in our orientation and education programs, she said, her mind already working through the implications. New veterans are being introduced to a complex system without receiving the practical knowledge they need to navigate it effectively. Your approach could revolutionize how we prepare veterans for their transition to VA services. Thomas considered this perspective, clearly intrigued by the possibility of addressing systemic issues rather than just helping individuals on a case-by-case basis. General, I've noticed that the official orientation materials focus heavily on eligibility requirements and general program descriptions, but they don't provide the tactical knowledge that veterans actually need to get things accomplished. Exactly. The general agreed enthusiastically. What you're describing is the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Military personnel understand this distinction better than anyone, but somehow our veteran services programs have failed to apply this principle to their own operations. Robert Martinez, who had been quietly organizing the information Thomas had provided, looked up with a thoughtful expression. You know what would be really helpful? If someone could create a practical guide that explains how this system actually works, not just what services are supposedly available. Something written by veterans who have figured out how to make it work. The suggestion sparked immediate interest from the other veterans present, several of whom began discussing what such a resource might include. General Hawkins watched Thomas's reaction carefully, noting how he was mentally cataloging the ideas being proposed and considering their feasibility. A practical guide would be valuable, Thomas agreed, but it would need to be regularly updated as procedures change, and it would have to be specific enough to provide real guidance without becoming so detailed that it's overwhelming to use. That's exactly the kind of project that could be developed through a formal consulting arrangement, the general suggested, seeing an opportunity to connect Thomas's obvious capabilities with institutional resources that could amplify his impact. VA has been looking for ways to improve veteran orientation and ongoing support services. Someone with your knowledge and communication skills could design and implement programs that would benefit thousands of veterans. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a staff member who had been dispatched to check on the situation that had originally brought the general to the main entrance. The staff member looked around at the group of veterans engaged in animated discussion about navigating VA services, clearly surprised by the transformation that had occurred. General, I was told there was a disturbance here that required your attention, the staff member said, looking confused by the calm, educational atmosphere that now characterized the gathering. The situation has been resolved, General Hawkins replied with a slight smile. In fact, it's evolved into something much more productive. This gentleman, Mr. Chen, has been providing excellent guidance to help veterans understand our procedures more effectively. The staff member looked at Thomas with new interest, recognizing that whatever he had done had successfully de-escalated a potentially difficult situation, while providing valuable assistance to multiple veterans. Would it be possible to arrange for Mr. Chen to speak with our patient services coordinator? This kind of practical guidance could be very helpful for our orientation programs. Thomas glanced at his watch, remembering that he still had his own medical appointment to attend. I'd be happy to discuss that possibility, but I do need to get to my scheduled appointment soon. Of course, the general acknowledged. But before you go, I want to make sure we have a clear plan for following up on the opportunities we've discussed. Your demonstration here has convinced me that your expertise could benefit veteran services at a level far beyond individual consultations. The elderly Vietnam veteran who had been part of the conversation stepped forward. Mr. Chen, I don't know what your background is, but you've helped more veterans in the last 20 minutes than most people manage in a year. Whatever the general is proposing, I hope you'll seriously consider it. Thomas looked around at the faces of the veterans who had benefited from his impromptu guidance session, seeing genuine gratitude and hope in their expressions. The realization that his knowledge and experience could have such immediate positive impact was clearly affecting his perspective on the possibilities the general had been presenting. 6 months later, Thomas Chen stood at the podium in the main auditorium of the Pentagon, looking out at an audience of senior military officers, VA administrators, and veteran service organization leaders. The same weathered cap sat on his head, but now the people in the room understood exactly what it represented. His transformation from an overlooked veteran navigating bureaucracy to a recognized expert, reshaping veteran services had been nothing short of remarkable. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues," Thomas began, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that had impressed General Hawkins during their first encounter. "When I was ordered to remove my cap at a security checkpoint 6 months ago, I thought I was just another veteran trying to get through the system quietly. Today, I want to share what we've learned about transforming that system to better serve the people who sacrificed for our nation." The presentation screen behind him displayed statistics that would have been impossible to achieve without institutional support. The pilot program he had developed with General Hawkins had successfully reduced average veteran claim processing time by 43%, increased first-time appointment completion rates by 67%, and created a replicable model that was being implemented at VA facilities across the country. General Hawkins sat in the front row, wearing her dress uniform with obvious pride as she watched Thomas command the attention of some of the most senior military leadership in the country. The man who had been reluctant to remove his cap for identification verification was now addressing 4-star generals, cabinet-level officials, and congressional staffers about revolutionary approaches to veteran care. "The key insight that drove our success," Thomas continued, "was recognizing that veterans don't need more programs. They need better navigation tools and practical guidance from people who understand both military, culture, and bureaucratic realities." We redesigned our approach around peer mentorship and tactical knowledge transfer rather than traditional case management. In the audience, Robert Martinez sat wearing his own military cap, now serving as a regional coordinator for the veteran navigation program that had grown out of Thomas's initial guidance at the medical center. The transformation in his own life had been dramatic, from a frustrated veteran trapped in bureaucratic loops to a leader, helping hundreds of other veterans successfully access their earned benefits. The elderly Vietnam veteran who had been part of that original conversation was also present, having become one of the program's most effective volunteer coordinators. His Agent Orange claim had been successfully processed within weeks of receiving Thomas's guidance, and he had since helped dozens of other Vietnam-era veterans navigate similar claims with unprecedented success rates. The program's effectiveness stems from a simple principle that military personnel understand instinctively, Thomas explained to the rapt audience. Mission success depends on having the right intelligence, proper preparation, and experienced leadership. We applied these concepts to veteran services by creating intelligence networks that provide real-time information about bureaucratic procedures, preparation protocols that equip veterans with tactical knowledge before they engage with the system, and leadership structures that connect new veterans with experienced navigators. Admiral Sarah Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations, raised her hand during the question period. "Mr. Chen, the results you're presenting are impressive, but how do we scale this approach to serve the millions of veterans across the country? The personal touch that seems central to your success might be difficult to replicate on a national level." Thomas nodded, having anticipated this critical question. "Admiral, that's exactly why we've focused on creating multiplier effects rather than trying to provide direct service to every individual veteran. Each veteran we train in navigation techniques becomes capable of helping dozens of others. Each successful outcome creates a case study that improves our procedures for future participants. We're not just helping individual veterans, we're building a knowledge base and support network that grows stronger with each success. The presentation continued with detailed breakdowns of cost savings, efficiency improvements, and veteran satisfaction metrics that demonstrated the program's impact. But Thomas knew that the most important measure of success wasn't captured in statistics. It was visible in the faces of veterans who had regained hope and confidence in their ability to access the services they had earned through their military sacrifice. Secretary of Veterans Affairs Michael Thompson approached the podium as Thomas concluded his presentation. Mr. Chen, on behalf of the administration and the millions of veterans who will benefit from your innovations, I want to formally recognize your extraordinary contribution to veteran services. Your work represents exactly the kind of transformational thinking we need to honor our commitments to those who have served. As applause filled the auditorium, Thomas remained characteristically humble, gesturing toward the veterans in the audience who had helped develop and implement the program. Mr. Secretary, this success belongs to every veteran who was willing to share their knowledge and experience to help others. What we've accomplished demonstrates what becomes possible when we recognize and utilize the expertise that exists within the veteran community itself. Following the presentation, Thomas found himself surrounded by senior officials eager to discuss implementation strategies, funding mechanisms, and expansion possibilities. The conversations were professional and substantive, a far cry from the dismissive interactions he had experienced during his years of quietly seeking routine medical care. General Hawkins approached him during a brief break in the discussions. "Thomas, I have to ask, do you ever regret that morning when I insisted you remove your cap? If you had just walked through security without incident, none of this might have happened." Thomas smiled, adjusting the cap that had started this entire journey. "General, I've learned that recognition often comes when we least expect it, and sometimes when we're most reluctant to accept it. That morning taught me that hiding our capabilities doesn't serve anyone well, not ourselves and certainly not the people who could benefit from our experience. The program has grown beyond anything either of us imagined," she observed, looking around at the gathering of military and civilian leaders who were now implementing Thomas's innovations on a national scale. What started as a security verification has become a blueprint for transforming how we serve veterans across the entire system. Thomas nodded, watching as Robert Martinez and other program participants engaged in animated discussions with congressional staffers about legislative support for expanding the initiative. The most rewarding part isn't the recognition or the institutional changes. It's seeing veterans regain confidence in their ability to navigate systems that should be serving them. Every time someone like Robert successfully resolves issues that had been frustrating them for months, we're demonstrating that the system can work when veterans have the right information and support. As the event concluded and attendees began making plans for implementing the program in their respective regions, Thomas reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. The cap he wore represented not just his own service and sacrifices, but the collective experience and wisdom of countless veterans who had contributed to developing solutions that honored their shared commitment to service. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Thomas Chen had evolved from an overlooked veteran to a recognized leader, but more importantly, he had helped create a sustainable system that would continue serving veterans long after his own involvement ended. The secret insignia beneath his cap remained hidden from casual observation, but its significance was now properly understood and appreciated by those who mattered most. As Thomas walked out of the Pentagon that evening, the Washington sunset casting long shadows across the courtyard, he paused to call his granddaughter. At 8 years old, she was too young to understand the details of his military service, but she had always been fascinated by his stories about helping people. "Grandpa, did you have a good day at work?" she asked in her innocent voice. Thomas smiled, looking back at the building where his life's work had just been recognized at the highest levels of government. Yes, sweetheart. I think I finally figured out what I was supposed to do when I grew up. You're already grown up, Grandpa. She giggled. Sometimes it takes a while to understand our real mission, he replied, touching the bill of his weathered cap, but when we find it, everything makes sense. 3 years later, the Thomas Chen Veteran Navigation Program had been implemented at over 200 VA facilities nationwide, helping more than 50,000 veterans successfully access their benefits. The unassuming man who had been ordered to remove his cap had become a legend in veteran services, proving that true leadership often comes from the most unexpected places. His cap still bears the same secret insignia, a reminder that heroes walk among us every day, waiting for the right moment to step forward and change the world. What did you think of Thomas Chen's incredible journey? Stories like this remind us that extraordinary people are all around us, often hiding in plain sight until circumstances reveal their true capabilities. If this story inspired you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share amazing real-life stories of courage, determination, and hidden heroes every week. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone surprised you with their hidden talents or background. Where are you watching from today? We love connecting with our global community of viewers who appreciate stories of service, sacrifice, and unexpected recognition. Thank you for being part of our journey.